We are really pleased today to have with us Dr. Ben Abbott. Dr. Abbott is a professor of environmental science and sustainability at Brigham Young University. He works on renewable energy, climate feedbacks, aquatic ecosystems, wildfire, and air quality. It's a lot. He's particularly interested in science communication and improving our commitment to environmental stewardship. If you're familiar with Dr. Abbott, it might be because he has been the most vocal opponent in the scientific world to a proposal that involves dredging Utah Lake for the sake of building habitable islands. He's been the subject of interviews with KSL, the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, and he's also worked with state legislatures, the Utah Divisions of Natural and Water Resources, and collaborated with his peers in the scientific community on Utah Lake conservation. So he is eminently qualified today to talk to us a little bit about Utah Lake restoration. He and his wife Rachel have 4 children who, he says, take after them in their love of animals, TV, and biking. His talk today is titled Muddy Reflections, How We Lost Our Way Restoring Utah's Most Misunderstood Lake. If you would join me in welcoming Dr. Abbott.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks to all of you for attending. If at any moment during this presentation you have an impulse to sue me for anything, then refer to me as Mr. Abbott, not Dr. Abbott, and it'll all work out fine. Right behind these curtains, is the subject of my talk today, and the symposium has just been fabulous, thinking about what restoration means. And I'm going to just jump right in. I saw this spooky Halloween Utah Lake picture yesterday on Facebook. And I don't know who Nathan Walker is, but I just stole it from the internet and put it here. And I wanted to recognize the partners, because as Michael mentioned, I have ended up being kind of the poster child of this issue, but I am by no means the smartest or most important player in this story. There are many people here in the room and hundreds of thousands of individual people all throughout the community who are engaged on this issue. So I'm an ecosystem ecologist, and we only have 4 laws in ecology. So you're gonna learn everything you need to know about ecology on this single slide. And there will be a quiz at the end, so get ready. Here are 4 ecological laws. Everything is connected to everything else. Everything must go somewhere. Nature knows best. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So these maybe are different than some of the scientific laws you've learned elsewhere in physics or chemistry. But ecology is a systems science. It's trying to understand how multiple complex living and non-living parts create emergent behavior. And so these are principles that apply to every interaction. Now you'll see some of these actually have parallels in physics and chemistry, right? Conservation of energy and mass. But there's some cryptic ones, like nature knows best. And that's sometimes described as the law of unintended consequences. But we'll get into that a little bit more. In case that didn't seem scientific enough, I've put a fancy quote up here in italics, so it looks really fancy and credible. This is a quote from Oliver Morton in his book, The Planet Remade, on geoengineering. And here is his take. He says, "The paradox in a nutshell is this. Humans are grown so powerful that they have become a force of nature. And forces of nature are those things which, by definition, are beyond the power of humans to control." And so this is kind of the fundamental paradox of the Anthropocene. We have moved from a time period where we were just one of many species in the Earth system to being the dominant vertebrate, no question at all, and in many ways the dominant force for many of Earth's great cycles. And as we think about, I don't know if you noticed, but ecology, this is Barry Commoner, who formalized these 4 laws, and he called ecology the science of survival. How do individuals, how do populations, how do communities survive? And so that's really our question that goes beyond Utah Lake. And Marion's talk was so beautiful about this. How do we survive in a way that allows us to thrive and be happy? And so this is a non-rhetorical question that I'd love to get your input on. What do you think the most pressing environmental issues are in the Anthropocene? And we're going to use this corny online interface. Don't you love, like, at least it's not an eye clicker. Anybody, are those still used anywhere? Okay, few. So if you're willing to, you can scan this with your phone, or if you've got a laptop, go to Poll EV and then put in Ben Abbott 511. And I'm going to give you a few questions throughout the presentation. And then at any time, if you've got a question that you want to ask, you can put it into the Q&A, and we'll circle back to that as well. So the first question is, what, in your opinion, are the most important environmental issues? And you can submit multiple submissions, but try to make them a single word if you would. So let's see if this works, so we can see the results. Okay. Really cool. First, whoever was fast on the phone there. Not talking about a response in the Earth system, but an attitude. Carbon, warming, waste, plastic. And this is a word cloud where if an answer is given more than once, it'll get bigger. So I'll give you just a few more seconds. Wow, really important set of issues here. Pollution, waste, greed, carbon, ignorance, and many, many other issues. Now, I'm not able to definitively say which of these is the most important, right? Depends on what you're thinking about, depends on what your values are. I don't know what toots means. Can anybody? But here's my take on this. I think these are the 4 most important environmental issues in the Anthropocene. And again, it's totally fine if you disagree. Number 1, harm to human well-being from environmental pollution. Number 2, decline of life on Earth. Number 3, disruption of Earth's great cycles. And number 4, climate change. And there's actually a distinction between these 4 things. I care about numbers 3 and number 4 because of how they affect number 1 and number 2. So my values actually are human well-being and all of the other amazing life in the Earth system. Right? We might someday disrupt biogeochemical cycles on Venus. Let's not do it if we can avoid it, but someday we might. We know that Venus has experienced extreme climate change in the past, but there aren't the moral implications of when that happens here, when it's caused by us, because of how it affects people and life. And just to try to persuade you, here's a figure from a recent paper comparing premature deaths from different risk factors. And you can see a whole suite of important things here, right, that we should really care about. So homicide, wars and terrorism, communicable diseases, issues associated with access to food, psychological issues. But notice at the top, 15.1 million premature deaths each year because of our unhealthy relationship with the environment. This is caused primarily from air pollution, secondarily from water pollution. So a really big deal, and not something, by the way, that is of concern in the future. This number is going up as far as we can tell. What about other life on Earth? This is a paper from 3 years ago in Science, found that currently 1 million species are threatened with extinction, but it's the number 2 that really is a kick in the teeth. There's been an 80% decline of wild biomass globally. Now, this isn't talking about microorganisms and plants, but when you look at animals, vertebrates, in aquatic and terrestrial environments, we have replaced them. The human biomass, and more importantly, our livestock, which outweighs us by a factor of 2 to 3, has basically replaced that. And we have increased the background rate of extinction by at least 100-fold and maybe 1,000-fold, driving 2,000 to 10,000 species to extinction each year. On to the third issue, the disruption of Earth's great biogeochemical cycles. You can see this one from space. This is a satellite image from the Baltic Sea, looking at algal blooms. So these green colors are algal blooms created by agricultural runoff pouring into the Baltic Sea. You can go anywhere in the world and take an oxygen measurement in the ocean, and you'll see lower oxygen concentrations than there would have been naturally by this global nutrient overload. This is one that isn't on many people's radars, right? All of us are going to right away identify climate change, super important. But we're not thinking about how does our food system, how does our energy system affect these great nutrient cycles. And everything that we do, everything that we consume creates release of nutrients, which are a good thing on their own, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So 2/3 of freshwater and marine ecosystems are now experiencing eutrophication. That's a Greek word that means overnourishment. So yes, we have algal blooms on Utah Lake. Guess what? We have them almost everywhere. And then the final, number 4 here, this is a series of satellite images taken last year showing the western United States. And wildfire is important. It's even crucial to many ecosystems. But we have doubled the annual extent of area burned looking at the satellite record back till 1984. And we see this same increase in areas that are heavily managed and those that aren't managed at all. So despite what you often see presented as a debate, do we really know it's climate change? Yes, it's climate change that is causing this increase in wildfire. And what was our number 1 ecological law? Everything is connected to everything else. And if you track these masses of smoke and particulate pollution, they travel all around the world. In the United States, air pollution is getting better everywhere except for in the Northwest, where you have the concentration of wildfire. So a connection not only between things, but between these issues and challenges. And so climate change is, of course, affecting more than just wildfire. It's a threat to food supply, national security, economic growth, biodiversity, causing wildfire and drought and life on Earth. So the conclusion, I don't want to just depress you all. These things are depressing so far. So I failed. But I want us to change the way we're thinking about the environment. This is the sustainable development framework. You've got circles. It's a nice Venn diagram, but it's a competitive model. Are you going to emphasize the environment, the economy, or society? And there's been a proposal that I wholeheartedly support to reorganize how we're thinking about these. So everything in human society takes place within the Earth system. And the economy is just a subset of society. And so it's not an either or. Should we either protect the environment or stimulate the economy? That's ridiculous thinking. I mean, it's completely, it doesn't make any sense. We have to say, to take care of people, how will we protect and restore our common home? And I think that this change, you've just moved the circles around a little bit, but it's important. And again, this has been brought up already. Here's a quote again by Barry Commoner. When any environmental issue is pursued to its origins, it reveals an inescapable truth, that the root cause of the crisis is not to be found in how men interact with nature, but in how they interact with each other. that to solve the environmental crisis, we must solve the problems of poverty, racial injustice, and war. And notice the date on this. You might have picked up even from the language, right? Different, referring to humans as men. But this was a while ago. And of course, if you speak to any elder in an indigenous community, they will tell you the same thing, right? People that have an understanding of these systems. So, second question now. What are the biggest causes of these problems? Now I want us to transition into potential solutions. So it should just pull up on its own if you open up that browser again. And in some ways, many of you answered this already, thinking about the last question. Is that pulling up or not? It's not? Okay. We'll just scrap it then. Anybody want to raise their hand and say, add a cause on there? And I'm going to emphasize what you mentioned already. Apathy, greed, really interesting human drivers of it. Yeah, way at the back. Corporations. Yeah, capitalist, consumerist system. All the way at the back, then here. Capitalism, yeah.
I want to say willful ignorance.
Willful ignorance, and that's important, right? We're all ignorant of most things, right? I mean, we know a tiny fraction. We understand a tiny fraction of what's going on, but it's dangerous when it's willful. Also, the writer Barry Commoner has a beautiful phrase that I like. Arrogant ignorance is what's important. When we're dismissing it, when we're not aware of what we know. And that connects to that third ecological law of nature knows best. When we don't have humility. Any other things we want to put up on the board for causes? Yeah. Political gain. Oh my goodness, this is such a huge driver. Thinking about how am I going to win the next election rather than thinking about what will help our community survive and thrive over the long term. Yeah.
Actually, Yuval Noah Harari actually says in a quote, there's no such thing as famine, only political famine.
Yeah.
People starve because a politician wants them to.
Thank you for that comment. So I'll just tick through these again. This is not the definitive list, but when I was thinking about how I'd answer it, here are these connections between dirty energy, loss of habitat, invasive species, overconsumption. But then, as you clued in on right at the beginning, we live in the Anthropocene. What matters most is what's going on in people's minds, how they're choosing to live their lives individually and communally. So these human attributes are driving all of this. So are we at the end of the Anthropocene? This epoch just started. Most geologists say it started sometime in the 20th century. Is it going to be the shortest epoch in the history of the planet that we know about? This is a comment that I saw in a recent YouTube video about sustainability. You may not be able to read it, but our friend Dueling Bongos tells us it's not worth even trying because our choices are between ending civilization with nuclear war or all starving to death because of climate change and disruption of global agriculture. What generation do we think that Dueling Bongos is from? Oh. Gen X, I heard, maybe. Yeah, Gen X are old now. Isn't it weird how things change? So everyone millennial and older is old. So no, definitely not old. This is, I don't know, but it's probably a boomer, right? Just totally cynical and worn out. Now, this person may have been legitimately engaged. It can be frustrating to try to effectuate change, especially if, it can be really frustrating. But I think of it this way. We are at the end of the Anthropocene, but we can go one of two ways. This is a paper from Johannes Rockstrom and others looking at the Earth has been here for the whole history of human civilization, this uncommonly stable time period of the Holocene. And we now are over here in this extreme place. CO2 concentrations haven't been observed this high for millions of years. as far as we can tell in the entire history of the Earth, things have not been changing as rapidly as they are right now, both with temperature and increase in carbon dioxide, loss of habitat. So are we going to careen off into a new state that may be incompatible with human civilization, or are we going to bring it back into the range, this kind of stabilized Earth? So I actually think the question is it the end of the Anthropocene in a bad way, or are we going to go back to the Holocene? And I think this isn't even a question. We have to go back to the Holocene, right? Like this, everything depends on it. The entire Earth system, all of the people. So this is the UN Secretary General who said this. I think it's very blunt and beautiful. Humanity is waging a war on nature. This is suicidal. Making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. It must be the top priority of everyone, everywhere. Isn't that cool? This isn't something that we can do just with a few environmentalists. It's not something that any single company or government can accomplish. Every job needs to be a climate job or an environment job. Whatever you are doing, and each of you have unique gifts, unique resources, and you can make a difference wherever you are going. This has to be our top priority. And in typical Secretary Gutierrez style, he then announced a global program. So you may not know, we are in the decade of ecological restoration. So starting last year, and it's an incredibly ambitious goal, not only of carbon neutrality, right? That's in the mitigation space, limiting harm. Let's not make things worse, but actually becoming nature positive. And this isn't the nature with a capital N that Marion mentioned, that's the untrammeled, no place for humans. But this is the idea of moving into a positive reciprocal relationship with the Earth system. And this is based off of not just someone's wishful thinking, but a very important group of global researchers who think that this is possible, to have net zero loss of nature and then moving into positive by the end of the decade. A really exciting action moving forward. We're not alone when we fight these battles. Often you feel alone. You feel like the wind is blowing against you. That is not true. There are millions of people working on these issues around the world. So that's great to have a goal, but how are we going to do it? And this is one of my favorite papers on restoration. It's also awesome because it's only 2 pages long. Margaret Palmer, a really important researcher, she says we need to move beyond a focus on the size and number of projects to focus on how these projects are designed and implemented. Approaches based on restoring the fundamental ecological processes that lead to self-sustaining ecosystems are essential. So it's not just good intentions. We need to figure out how to do this. And if we look at what common characteristics are there that can move towards self-sustaining systems, here are 3 factors. It's kind of a sniff test. Is it conserving habitat? Connected and expansive habitat, right? Ecosystems can't sustain themselves if they're these little disconnected, fragmented islands, right? They need to have passability. Are we restoring the disturbance regime? This is a technical term from ecology, and it sounds really bad. You know, who would vote to say, I'd like a disturbance regime in my life? But disturbance is our word for change, for dynamic movement. And ecosystems are not static machines. They need room to move. So the Provo Delta restoration is an interesting example of this, right? The Provo River wants to move. It needs to move to be healthy. But we channelized the river and said, you have to go into the lake right here, because farmers and people with houses don't like it when the river decides to move across their field. The Provo River Delta restoration is trying to restore some of that habitat, so there's diversity, water moving around. And then finally, are we focused on a biological community? Not a single species, but all of the interacting species, including the most important ones, which almost always are the small, invisible ones. Is it complete? Is there redundancy there? And Dr. Palmer then lays out this this range of approaches, right? From conservation, that's where we can protect what is there, to restoration, and this can mean many different kinds of things, as we've been discussing today, trying to move back in the traditional sense, reducing impacts of the things that we're doing, and then mitigation, where we're saying, okay, we've caused damage in one area, let's try to compensate it in another. And it's really important, these are not all equal. And over here, this is less effort and more likely to succeed. Over here, this is more effort and less likely to succeed. Now, all of these are worthwhile, right? If we have to disturb something, it's better to mitigate it than just write it off. But it's not a replacement for conservation and restoration. And if we're, the topic of the symposium today, if we're committed to restoration, where are we moving towards? How much restoration? By when? And how will we know if we succeeded? And there's this amazing snarky comment in Paul Merton Stewart where they say, the projects with the poorest evaluation strategies generally have the most positive conclusions about the effects of restoration. Isn't that awesome? So if we don't measure it, if we just say, you know what, we finished the project and it felt really good, then that's a great way to feel good about the project. It may not be a great way to ensure long-term livability of the human, of our shared home. Okay, I'm going to skip over a couple slides here because everything's taught better in cartoon form than in diagram forms. This is a cartoon that one of my students put together looking at a natural disturbance regime before human changes in habitation. A bad example of how we can try to control and make rigid using these hard path solutions. And then, of course, the inevitable breaking of those and the damage that happens to people. Remember, there's no separation between the environment and people. But then what I really like about this is she put, this is Leslie Lang, she put a positive example down here, actually showing let's leave the river as a dynamic system that's going to flood. We can have human access to that river and interactions. It does not look the same as it did before, but we've imitated nature. We've learned from nature and are trying to reproduce that. So now let's move on to Utah Lake. This is a sticker from the 1960s, trying to convince people to come and visit Utah. Isn't it beautiful? So it's such a good question here. Do you notice, I make in my title, I said that Utah Lake is the most misunderstood ecosystem in Utah. It's not, it didn't even make the map. You've got the Great Salt Lake here and then Sevier Lake. Sevier Lake is an ephemeral lake. It used to be filled more of the time. We diverted most of the water from it. Sorry, I think I said Sevier and it triggered my phone. So this is a view. I mean, it shows such a reduced idea of what this place is, of who inhabits this place and what it has to offer. So I'm not going to be able to teach you everything about Utah Lake, but there's a diverse group of people that have put together this document at utahlake.byu.edu. And this was the outcome of a symposium here last year at UVU. And I'd really encourage you to take some time to learn about the history, current status, and potential future for Utah Lake. I'm going to give you the abbreviated version in just about 5 minutes so we can take some questions. Utah Lake is the largest freshwater lake in the state. It's been the centerpiece of Utah Valley literally for thousands of years, right? Long before we knew this place as Utah Valley. This was the center of a whole suite of indigenous cultures, the Timpanogos Nation, Paiute, Goshute, branches of the Shoshone and Ute moving through this area. Why does it matter? There are a million reasons why the lake matters. Here are 8 that I really care about. Not going to go through all of them, but it regulates our local climate. It is the second largest tributary to the Great Salt Lake. If we want to save the Great Salt Lake, we have to be thinking about Utah Lake. It's a water source for millions of people in the Jordan Valley and Salt Lake Valley. It is crucial habitat. We live in the Great Basin, which is 98% land 1.5% saline lake, and about 0.5% freshwater. So this is a crucial fragment. It's an island of water in the vast sea of land of the Great Basin. It provides ecosystem services, removing nutrients and other pollutants. It protects our air quality. I'll show you a picture in just a second about that one. It provides economic benefits, recreation, views, and property values. Most important for me is number 8, the spiritual and cultural significance of this place. So here's a picture of Owens Lake in California, an ecosystem that wasn't taken care of. The water was diverted for urban and agricultural use. It was viewed as a worthless ecosystem. It was salty. There weren't fish that lived there. Once the lake bed was dry, it became the single largest source of particulate matter in the United States. It still is to this day. Los Angeles County is coming up on $5 billion spent abating the dust, which is substantially more than all of the economic value they've gotten from the water they diverted. So they saw an ecosystem and thought, let's improve that. We could use that water better than the way that nature is using it. They diverted it. It ended up not working. On the positive side, this is amazing data from birds that were tagged in the Utah Lake Great Salt Lake system, and then where they were observed. Isn't this a cool visualization looking at how individual birds, and we know that we don't tag that many, and so we know that there are many more. 10 million birds move through this corridor. And as the Great Salt Lake continues to shrink, which it will over the next couple of years, now hopefully we're moving in a direction of conserving and restoring water flow to the lake, but it still is going to be a couple of years. Utah Lake habitat's going to be that much more important, right, for the entire Pacific Flyway. Despite what you hear in the news, Utah Lake is also heavily used by people. Now, boaters, especially those with super fancy power boats who want to go wakeboard in the lake, it's a shallow lake. And so it's not ideal for that kind of boating. It's fabulous for sailing, and actually in the springtime it's good for power boating as well. But all kinds of different ways to interact with the lake. But in the 1960s and 1970s, the lake experienced an ecosystem state change. So combined layers of pressure, diversion of water from the lake, the addition of pollution to the lake, fracturing of the ecological community, loss of native species, loss of the human cultural understanding of how to be good stewards of the lake. Those things added up. And we saw a transition from a primarily reed, and we call them macrophytes. Isn't that an ugly name for plants? But macrophyte-dominated system to an algal-dominated system. So remember that idea of eutrophication? This was going on all over the world. This same time period, Lake Erie was declared dead. It was on the cover of Life magazine because of the enormous algal blooms that were there. Now, the June sucker, an endemic fish that lived in the lake, was listed as endangered. And this really started a series of steps that have led to impressive recovery of the Utah Lake system. Starting with the Clean Water Act in 1972, which started to clean up our wastewater inputs into the lake and the industrial flow into the lake. And it got supercharged in the 1980s with the listing of the June sucker. In 2002, the June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program, which is the worst acronym of any program I have ever heard of. What does June Sucker Recovery Implementation Program spell? JSRIP. June Sucker, rest in peace. It's just crazy. But it's also one of the most effective programs. It has been held up as an example nationwide and even internationally for the way that they have undertaken collaborative restoration of this ecosystem. They brought together strange bedfellows, Rio Tinto, the mine, agricultural water users, various cities, environmental groups, federal, state agencies to conserve water, restore habitat. Here's just a list of some of those partners. Again, mainly under the June Sucker RIP, but also the DNR, the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Actually, FFSL can give them a run for their money for worst acronym. Should we say that all together? FFSL. It's really hard to say. Dozens of projects, many of which have been highly effective. I'll highlight this one here, the large-scale carp removal. 123 blue whales worth of carp have been removed from Utah Lake. Isn't that amazing? Kind of mind by trying to visualize that. An 80% decline in the biomass of carp in the lake, allowing many of the native species to start, we call it recruiting or gaining in population. So here's a hydrological comparison. That conservation of water to Utah Lake has allowed the lake to have stable water levels through time, whereas the Great Salt Lake is in major decline. The Great Salt Lake didn't have an endangered species to help us start to protect it. Here is the recovery of the Junesucker. It went from 300 individuals existing in the whole world in the 1990s to observing over 50,000 in 2022. An incredible, unlikely recovery. I mean, it's really, it's a miraculous success story. The algal blooms, we're making progress on them. This is a time series based on satellite imagery, showing substantial declines all times of year, spring, summer, and fall, from the 1990s and early 2000s to where we are today. I don't know if anybody was around during the 1990s, but there was a t-shirt that said "Ski the Scum" on Utah Lake. Now we hear more about the algal blooms now because of changes in how we identify them. But that is an artifact. If we look at the actual ecosystem, it's improving. And indeed, a nationwide study found that Utah Lake is in the cleanest category for algal blooms of all water bodies around the country, and even better than more than half of the water bodies in Utah. Finally, we have healthy sediments in most of the lake. There are a couple areas, especially in Provo Bay and up near the TSSD wastewater treatment plant, that may need some targeted dredging of a few inches of sediment. But thankfully, because it's such a huge lake, it has healthy, good sediment overall. So here's an overview of the current status. And as an ecosystem ecologist, even though I didn't do hardly any of this restoration, I just feel like patting myself on the back. Right? Everything is wonderful. It's all perfect. There's no work that needs to be done from here on out. But let's listen to some comments about Utah Lake. This is a press conference with Governor Cox.
Problem with it at all.
So how do you feel about islands on on Utah Lake now?
Well, that's a whole other issue. Certainly, there are some proposals around that. There's a lot of concern that's coming. We're watching that process very closely. We do need to do work on Utah Lake. There's no question. Utah Lake is a disaster right now. It's our most underutilized asset. It's our most underutilized resource, and every year we have major issues with Utah Lake. There has to be dredging, and it's incredibly expensive. And so the question is, how are we going to pay for saving Utah Lake and making that happen? This is a very novel idea, but again, there's a lot of pushback on that, a lot of environmental concerns. So we will look at those closely before any decisions are made. But everyone also agrees that something has to be done with Utah Lake. The controversy is over what and how to pay for it.
Governor, we've been asking.
So really interesting to see the perception of the ecosystem. Let's see if I can figure out how to go to the next slide. That's different, right? And so what we've realized is the ecosystem that exists, how do I get out of here? There we are. There really are two Utah lakes. But just on Monday, I heard Governor Cox came to BYU, and he called Utah Lake a trash lake. And again, said that neither he nor anybody ever goes there. Isn't that interesting? Strong opinions about the ecosystem, its value, and its trajectory without personal or scientific understanding of the issue. And of course, the message that he gave is exactly what the island developers, how they've described the lake. Everything's going in the wrong direction. The current efforts aren't working. We need to try something drastically different. So there's the physical ecosystem, and then there's the perceived ecosystem of what's happening. And this is, again, we live in the Anthropocene, and I think that the perceived ecosystem is more important in some ways than the physical ecosystem, because that's going to determine what we do next. Are we going to throw it all away and move in a totally different direction, or continue the work that is already providing dividends? So almost to the end here. On the way over here on the bus, I was thinking about who the stakeholders were. And again, you may not be able to read all of this, but you have indigenous groups that are engaged on this, university researchers, recreationalists, the general public. And I've tried to organize them by amount of information that they have versus the amount of influence that they have currently. And you may disagree with this, and certainly it's not right. It literally was my bus UVX assessment of how this should be arranged. But there's a general negative correlation right now, where those who understand the system the most have the least influence. And if we want to ensure long-term, legitimate restoration and positive management, I think that we need to change that. And this is, thankfully, in my field, we're finally getting on the bandwagon and understanding we need to be focusing on education, outreach, connection to change these long-term behaviors. So I'll skip over these. These are my specific recommendations. You can read those at utahlake.byu.edu. And I wanted to end with this Wangari Maathai, a Nobel Prize-winning environmental conservationist. She says, "We are called to assist the earth to heal her wounds, and in the process heal our own. Indeed, to embrace the whole of creation in all its diversity, beauty, and wonder, recognizing that sustainable development, democracy, and peace are indivisible is an idea whose time has come." And I love this connection to personal well-being as well, because we live in a disorienting time where we feel anxiety and isolation and fear and hopelessness. You can't express what you're worried about without being attacked. Don't know where to go for reliable information. And this isn't surprising when we think about how we are treating our home. We need to, for our own individual well-being, for our community, and for the planet, to change that direction, and I believe that we can. So thank you very much for your attention, and take any questions.
Okay, do you happen to know how big the literary impact is on spreading this kind of news and this kind of awareness? I'm coming from an eco-poetic class.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious about how the literary world is playing into this.
Yeah, there is an effort right now at a Tory House Press, a publisher that's compiling essays about Utah Lake that they're going to present to the legislature in the upcoming session to try to help them understand how many people have a connection with and the value and importance of this. I think that is honestly more important than the ecological research that's going on. We know enough to know what needs to happen next. We need to help everybody understand that. So I don't have specific helpful recommendations except a huge endorsement. Do that, connect with other people, and try to get that out there. There's an amazing group called the Utah Lake Photography Club. If you're old like me, it's on Facebook. It's also on Instagram. And they are sharing awesome pictures every day of Utah Lake. And I think that is changing hearts and minds, again, much more than a scientific paper.
So recently I've been a lot more mindful about like recycling stuff that I buy from the store and reusing vegetables. So like I replant them and they grow back.
Oh,
So.
super cool.
But I guess my question was, that's like, how much of an impact can one person have if that one person just recycles, like, as comparison? Because I don't know how many people actually do that. But
Yeah.
like, I guess the idea is to get everybody thinking like how much recycling actually impacts this whole problem.
So yeah, great question. And I'm going to break it up into two parts. The recycling, what are the 3 R's of sustainability? Reduce, reuse, recycle. And they're put in prioritized order. We should start by reducing. And this is very similar. Remember that graph of the conservation on one end and then the mitigation on the other. Recycling's on the mitigation side. It's better than just throwing it away, but it is not a solution. And in fact, it's often promoted by kind of the capitalistic, consumeristic system because you can just tack it on at the end. That's not to disparage. Recycling is better than just throwing it away. But I'm going to get to what I think is the more important point you bring up of individual action. And this is sometimes presented to you as a dichotomy. Are we either going to have individual action or systems change? And that it's another fake choice. When we make individual actions, that can save us money and make us happier, make us healthier. It also puts pressure on people. People start to see, and that makes systems change more likely. So we need everybody doing everything they can individually, at the same time organizing to make sure we change the system. And I quite like Bill McKibben, a climate change activist. He says, when asked the question, what's the most important thing I can do as an individual? He says, don't act as an individual. That's what you can do individually. So start organizing, start talking with people. That's what's happened. This group that wanted to build the islands, they claimed to have $6.5 billion of investment. With a B, the B word, like an unfathomable amount. And yet they were shut down by a small group of ragtag stay-at-home parents and high school teachers and high school students and college students that organized, right? If they all had just been posting angry things on social media, it wouldn't have worked. But they organized an email campaign to put pressure on the legislature. So organize. But this idea that only one group can solve this, I believe, is false. We all need to be doing what we can.
Obviously, this is a huge effort and a huge impact on both the environment, but also on people in the environment that are living there. You were talking about the Provo River restoration and how, from what I understood, you're essentially asking people to vacate their land and their homes to re-guide the river. And there's also, Governor Cox was talking about the huge cost of this. I was wondering what some of your solutions are for the cost and for, getting people to see, the vision of what this is going to do and how this is going to help when they're told to, help fund or help by vacating their homes.
Yeah, totally. Great question. And I should specify the Provo River Delta restoration didn't involve anybody leaving their home, but it did involve a transfer of land. And it took a long time to develop that relationship with the landowner and help them understand, and finally they came on board. But this is a really important question of how do you build those relationships, and then how do you pay for these things? And what I'm going to say is most of the cost estimates that you hear are self-serving, made-up numbers. And so if I want to, for example, build islands on the lake, I'm going to say this is going to cost $3 billion to fix the lake. Oh my gosh. Utahns, do you want to pay $3.5 billion? Do you want to pay $3.5 billion in your taxes? No, of course not, right? So I've exaggerated the cost. Really, now that we have access to their full proposal, $3.5 billion is the cost of building islands, not of restoring the lake. And so I think we actually need to become quite informed and be critical about when people start throwing around these big numbers. Currently, if we look at the Phragmites removal, for example, the common reed that's invasive, we've reached about 70% removal of the Phragmites at a budget of a couple $100,000 a year. Very small budget. We gave these guys about 20 years worth of the Phragmites removal budget as a loan guarantee of taxpayer money for their so-called cheap and free option of fixing the lake. So they were saying, oh, this is all private industry and it's not going to take any taxpayer money. It was a flat-out lie. They still are trying to get almost $1 billion of subsidized loans from the EPA for this project. So again, we need to get, and I am an ecologist. I know a lot about nitrogen. I don't know a lot about financing. I never could have done this, but we got connected with 2 retired lawyers in Saratoga Springs who started scouring the SEC for information. We got connected to the Utah Home Builders Association, totally unlikely ally They invited us to come and started helping us understand how developers are feeling about this. So grow that network. Bring the gifts and understanding that you have, and then invite other people to participate.
Thanks for a great presentation, Ben. Two quick questions. One is, in Governor Cox's statement, this is a real perception that I would love some input on how we change.
Yeah.
He said it is an underutilized resource.
Yeah.
And I'm going, most people don't realize the attitude in the Utah laws and legislature. Provo River would run dry most of the months of the summer if it were not for the June sucker restoration. And people don't realize that in the state of Utah, underutilized means it's not designated in some, for example, nature doesn't count as a resource. And so I just wonder, do you have some perspective on how we can community-wise and individually and in our discussions raise the awareness that the legislatures potentially and the laws are already angling for a commercial utilization of this, not an ecological or environmental support?
Yeah, such an important question. And when I hear it's an underutilized asset, I try to decode that and think, what that means is it's not being used by people like me in the way that I'd like to. And so one of the things that we can do, if you go down to the shore of Vineyard, there's a beautiful trail there, and if you go down there on a Saturday or a Sunday, it is hopping. I mean, there are hundreds of people there. But guess what? They don't look like the people who are in our legislature. They don't have $100,000 boats, right? They're people that are out there interacting with the lake in a different way. And so we need to, there probably are ways. So I also take a view, whenever you get feedback, even if it's not well-intentioned and if it's not perfect, you still can learn from that. So Governor Cox has a point that there are things that we can also do to broaden the range of people interacting with the lake. So let's give him that and learn from that. But then on the education side, we need to just teach them. And the issue is there are lobbyists that are there all the time, right? That have a vested commercial interest, speaking to this asymmetry. But we can overcome that.
And the other quick question was
Sorry,
on
I
the
think
high
we're out of
swing-
time, so we'll have to move it for after the session. So let's just thank Dr. Abbott again for a really great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.